everybody's kind of garbled, including Linda and me.
Yeah, it is garbled.
Is it too loud, maybe?
I don't know.
Probably internet interference.
Is that any better?
That sounds better. My YouTube thing is kind of slow.
What about stopping the recording and then starting it and seeing if that makes a difference?
You sound clear to me.
You're still garbled. Like there's a lag on my voice.
Yeah. You're garbled when you talk here.
I'll be quiet.
Oh,
Teddy's
maybe
not
that
as,
works?
What is it?
you guys seem okay, Teddy and Vicky.
Oh, I think you're okay now that Linda turned off her mic.
Oh, I'll turn off mine.
Okay.
So it's we're going to talk a little about witchcraft, I guess, today. And witchcraft is thus particularly apt to be associated with, he talks of it as one of the third ways we distort spirit. And we do this by recognizing there's it makes fear. The whole thing is and all of these is talking about turning spirit and attributing it with human attributes that we actually attribute to the body. And like the body can, like our spirit can be possessed by something evil, because then we think that it's possible for spirit to be something other than it is, which, he uses the term soul and spirit as very similar, and they're both whole and perfect. So as our spirit is whole and perfect and is untouched by the ego, yet when we tend to think about it, when we give it these attributes like spirit possession and witchcraft, it's not what he's talking about, but our upside down thinking turns them into things that they're not, and then we find ourselves afraid or too enamored by them. And so it contributes to the fear that we have of ourselves and the desire to not know who we are, thinking that we already do know. So it should be noted that 1 involves only the body, and 2 involves an attempt to associate things with human attributes. So when he's talking about in 1, we think we're only the body, and the other, and in 2, what he's talking about is attributing something like spirit or soul with what we consider to be human attributes, therefore reducing them and making them things that they're actually not, and contributing to our misunderstanding of who we are. And then he says in 3, on the other hand, is a more serious level confusion because it endows the spirit with evil attributes. This accounts both for the religious zeal of its proponents and the aversion or fear of its opponents. Both attitudes stem from the same false belief. So, and this is, he gets into a statement here, which, this is not what the Bible means by possessed of the Holy Spirit. It is interesting to note that even those who did understand that could nevertheless express their understanding inappropriately. The concept of speaking in tongues was originally an injunction to communicate to everyone in his own language or on his own level. It hardly meant to speak in a way that nobody could understand. This strange error occurs when people do not understand the need for universal communication, but have contaminated it with possession fallacies. The fear engendered by this misperception leads to a conflicted state in which communication is attempted, but the fear is allayed by making the communication incomprehensible. It could also be said that the fear induced selfishness or regression, because incomprehensible communication is hardly a worthy offering from one Son of God to another. Knowledge can also be misinterpreted as a means of possession. Here, the content is not physical, and the underlying fallacy is more likely to be the confusion of mind and brain. The attempt to unite non-physical content with physical attributes is illustrated by statements like the thirst for knowledge. Then he says, "No, Helen, this is not what thirst in the Bible means. This term was used only because of man's limited comprehension and is probably better dropped. The fallacious use of knowledge can result in several errors, including A, the idea that knowledge will make the individual more attractive to others. This is the possession fallacy. B, the idea that knowledge will make the individual invulnerable. This is the reaction formation against the underlying fear of vulnerability." So that's interesting. The idea that knowledge will make the individual worthy. This is largely pathetic. So the second one is an interesting one. The idea that knowledge will make the individual invulnerable. This is the reaction formation against the underlying fear of vulnerability. So what he's saying is it's an admission that we think we're vulnerable and a way to bring about an invulnerability rather than through the admission. Rather than through the admission and acceptance of that's what we think and a solution to that. We make up a solution before we have the admission. Both you and Bill should consider type 4 very carefully. Like all these fallacies, it contains a denial mechanism which swings into operation as the fear increases, thus canceling out the error temporarily, but seriously impairing efficiency. Thus you claim you can't read, and Bill claims that he can't speak. Note that depression is a real risk here, for a child of God should never reduce his efficiency in any way. The depression comes from a peculiar pseudo-solution which reads, "A child of God is efficient. I am not efficient. Therefore, I am not a child of God." This leads to neurotic resignation, and this is a state which merely increases the depression. The corresponding denial mechanism for one is the sense of physical inability or impotence. The denial mechanism for two is often bankruptcy. Collectors of things often drive themselves well beyond their financial means in an attempt to force discontinuance. If this idea of cessation cannot be tolerated, a strange compromising involving both insatiable possessiveness and insatiable throwing away may result. An example is the inveterate or compulsive gambler, particularly the horse racing addict. Here, the conflicted drive is displaced both from people and things and is invested in animals. The implied derogation of people is the cause of the underlying extreme superstition of the horse racing addict. The alcoholic is a similar position, except that his hostility is more inward than outward directed. Defenses aimed at protecting or retaining errors are particularly hard to undo because they introduce second-order misperceptions which obscure the underlying errors still further. Now, I don't know if I've said this before when we were reading this. Bill and Helen were both psychologists in Columbia, and they dealt with people with mental illness in private practice. And the solutions that people had come up with, that therapists had come up with, were based on the problems they thought and the way to solve the problems, but the way to solve the effects of the problem, not really going deep enough into where the problem actually lies. And that whole idea of separation and trying to, what his saying is we have one problem with one solution. The idea that we're separate is the problem, and the experience that we're not separate brings about the resolution to that problem. But the nature of the idea of separation is to continue to separate. So we separate even our problems and make them into distinct rather than, influenced or extracted from the same one problem. So he's trying to give them a better way to help people and help other psychologists and psychiatrists to understand the nature of what's going on. So he's sort of dealing with them at a level that they can understand and
Also,
integrate.
the AA stuff. This really
Right.
addresses all the
Oh
AA
yeah, I mean,
of addiction and the particular form.
absolutely. And I think this being so early on is part of his trying to show Helen, that he is trustworthy and that he does know what he's talking about, rather than, just being something pie in the sky that has no connection to the world at all. So it's just interesting that he does deal with all these situations and all these problems in an attempt to help, an attempt to come up with a new form of therapy, which is, in a sense, is what the Course is. It's a therapy for everybody who thinks they're separate. It's also why he asked Bill. To be in charge of what would be left in and what would be kept out, so that it wasn't more fearful. Like, he didn't want the book to cause more fear. He wanted it to be able to deal with fear. And some of these things were, especially about the psychosexual stuff when it came to homosexuality. He wanted people to be less scared because there was understanding, rather than more scared because they continue to think themselves as not holy or as unworthy in terms of who they were created to be as children of God. We're here, right? Mm-hmm. The pseudo-corrective mechanism of 3 is apt to be more varied because of the more inclusive nature of the error, which already been mentioned. Some of the possibilities are listed below. One aspect of the perceived possessed conflict can be raised to predominance. If this is attempted in connection with possessing, it leads to paranoid solution. The underlying component of being possessed is retained in the persecution fantasies, which are generally concomitant. So you see, it's the scale of duality that he's dealing with, and the nature of the depth of the problem based on the scale of duality. So you go from one end to the other. The extreme ends produce more extreme behavior, whereas, there's a normal range where people sort of look and think that they're normal, but they're still out doing the same things, but not as an intense or or as a radical way as, the people who are at the either end of the spectrum. If being possessed is brought to ascendance, a state of some sort of possession by external forces results, but not with a major emphasis on attacking others. And that would be more like, we were talking about, like, somebody who goes to the racetrack and bets on horses. They're taking it out on themselves, they're trying not to take it out on somebody else. Attack by others becomes the more obvious component. In the more virulent forms, there is a sense of being possessed by demons, and unless there is vacillation with a catatonic solution, is more likely than a paranoid one. So you literally do nothing. You can't move. The focused paranoid has become more rigid in his solution and centers on one source of projection to escape from vacillation. Both 1, 2, and 4 are more likely to produce neurotic rather than psychotic states, though this is by no means guaranteed. However, 3 is inherently more vulnerable to the psychotic correction, again, because of the more fundamental level confusion which is involved. It should be noted, however, that the greater fear which is induced by 3 can itself reach psychotic proportions, thus forcing an individual closer and closer to a psychotic solution. It is emphasized here that these differences have no effect at all on the miracle, which can heal any of them with equal ease. This is because of the miracle's inherent avoidance of within-error distinctions. Its sole concern is distinguish between truth on the one hand and all kinds of error on the other. This is why some miracles seem to be of greater magnitude than others. But remember the first point in this course, that there is no order of difficulty in miracles. The emphasis on mental illness, which is marked in those notes, reflects the undoing aspect of the miracle. The doing aspect, of course, is much more important, but a true miracle cannot occur on a false basis. Sometimes the undoing must precede it. At other times, both can occur simultaneously, but you are not up to this at the moment. Further insights into mental illness can be misused and lead to preoccupation with one's own symptoms. This is why this area is less constructive for most people than a course primarily devoted to mental health. However, some professions will find some principles of mental illness constructive, especially those which are concerned with mental illnesses in others. This obviously includes psychologists. You're sort of saying psychologist is so concerned with mental illness, that is his mental illness. The obvious correction for all types of the possession fallacy is to redefine possession correctly. In the sense of taking over, the concept does not exist at all in divine reality, which is the only level of reality where real existence is a meaningful term. No one can be taken over unless he wills to be. However, if he places his mind under tyranny rather than authority, he intrudes a submission dominance concept onto free will himself. This produces the obvious contradiction inherent in any formulation that associates free will with imprisonment. Even in very mild forms, this kind of association is risky and may spread quite unexpectedly, particularly under external stress. This is because it can be internally controlled only if external conditions are peaceful. This is interesting. That reminds me of what they're talking about in the George Floyd case. You know, the police is under such stress. You don't know when they're going to flip and get so scared. Their reaction is overwhelming rather than, they're trained to be a particular way. And they're trained to react in a particular way. However, when they get fearful, they get under more stress than they know how to deal with, and their reaction is compounded and enhanced. And I think that's, what people need to understand, that, no matter what the training, in the right situation, when you're overstressed, no matter what you think you know or how you know it or how even-tempered you are, that even temper disappears into a fit of, more serious reaction.
And being policed in a gun culture is a stressful situation by itself.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's part of the situation, and you can imagine how the cops feel when they start talking about, well, they're going to take away, cops shouldn't have guns. Well, what do we do when people have guns and we don't have guns, Then there's the go away to take away guns. Well, what do we do if we can't defend them? It's just interesting. But that's exactly what he's talking about. Like that stress produces a reaction in an individual, which is much more enhanced or much more intense than just sort of thinking about it level-headedly. Mm-hmm. And, if people can stay level-headed, then they can deal with it reasonably. If they can't, then they're going to deal with it more unreasonably than it's already unreasonable. Why should you be at their mercy? This issue is very closely related to the whole possession issue. You insist on thinking that people can possess you if you believe that their thoughts can affect you regardless of what they think. You are perfectly unaffected by all expressions of lack of love. These can be either from yourself or others, or from yourself to others, or from others to you. So that's good. Because of who you are and the nature of love being whole and perfect, and there being nothing but love, you can be unaffected. However, that doesn't mean you can't think that you're being affected, which is the nature of the workbook. My thoughts about these things don't mean anything, and only my thoughts can affect me, not truth. Truth can't affect me because I am what truth is. But truth can be effective in dealing with, the errors we make in our own psychology. I'm glad you passed that test. It was crucial. Peace is an attribute in you. You cannot find it outside. All mental illness is some form of external searching. Mental health is inner peace. It enables you to remain unshaken by lack of love from without and capable through your own miracles to correct the external conditions which proceed from lack of love in others. When you are afraid of anything, you are acknowledging its power to hurt you. Remember that where your heart is, there is your treasure also. This means that you believe in what you value. If you are afraid, you are valuing wrongly. Human understanding will inevitably value wrong, and by endowing all human thoughts with equal power, will inevitably destroy peace. This is why the Bible speaks of the peace of God which passeth human understanding. Now, I know sometimes that's just taught as it passes understanding, which doesn't make a lot of sense when you think of it. But the peace of God passes human understanding. But it's not saying that it passes understanding. We could understand it. We just have to go beyond our understanding of peace and ask for what the peace of God actually is. This peace is totally incapable of being shaken by human errors of any kind. It denies the ability of anything which is not of God to affect you in any way. This is the proper use of denial. It is not used to hide anything, but it is used to correct error. It brings all error into light. And since error and darkness are the same, it abolishes error automatically. True denial is a very powerful protective device. You can and should deny any belief that error can hurt you. This kind of denial is not a concealment device, but a correction device. The right mind of the mentally healthy depends on it. You can do anything I ask. I have asked you to perform miracles, and you have made it very clear that these are natural, corrective, healing, and universal. There is nothing good they cannot do, but they cannot be performed in the spirit of doubt. Remember my own question before you ask yours. O ye of little faith, wherefore didst thou doubt? You have asked yourselves why you cannot really incorporate by words the idea of cannibalism. That's funny. In connection with the sacrament is a reflection of the distorted view of sharing. I told you before that the word thirst in connection with spirit was used in the Bible because of limited understanding of those to whom I spoke. I also told you not to use it. The same holds for expressions like feeding on. Symbiosis is misunderstood by the mentally ill who use it that way. But I also told you that you must recognize your total dependence on God, a statement which you did not like. God and the souls he created are symbiotically related. They are completely dependent on each other. The creation of the soul itself has already been perfectly accomplished, but the creation by souls has not. God created souls so he could depend on them because he created them perfectly. He gave them his peace so they would not be shaken and would be unable to be deceived. Whenever you are afraid, you are deceived. Your mind is not serving your soul. This literally starves the soul by denying it its daily bread. So I think we'll stop there because that's a decent half hour.
Nice, Teddy. Thank you.
So we have time if anybody would like to say anything. Turn off the recording and